with Dr. Brianna Stubbs. Enjoy the show.
I'm joined today by Dr. Brianna Stubbs PhD, a British rower and research scientist who won 2 gold medals for Great Britain at the 2013 and 2016 World Rowing Championships. She was the youngest person to row across the English Channel when she completed the feat in 2004 at the age of 12, and today her research is focused on ketone metabolism in athletes, the effects of different ketone supplements on human physiology, and the effects of ketone drinks on appetite. Brianna, thanks so much for taking the time today.
No problems at all. Thank you very much for having me, Mark.
Terrific. Well, perhaps we can start, Brianna, with maybe talking a little bit more about your impressive career in rowing and how that dovetailed into academia and research.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as you mentioned, my first kind of like foray into adventure sport and rowing was age 12. So my dad, he took part in the first ever ocean rowing race in 1997. So I was growing up in this household where doing kind of crazy extreme things and being physically active, it was just sort of very, very much a part of my life. And so I started rowing when I was 10 or 11, but before that I had sort of done some triathlons and some running and some cycling. I did my first ever running race age 7, I think. And
Nice.
I remember I was competing in the 8 to 9 year old category because I didn't have anything younger than age 8. And I remember competing against, at that age, you know, that one more year makes quite a big difference in how big you are. And so I was lining up against these like girls who had legs up to my ears. And I remember it was a 1 mile long race. And I remember running so hard that I was sick at the end, but I came third. And the trophy was as tall as my head. It was this huge trophy of this teeny weeny little 7-year-old. But
That's
that
fantastic.
kind of set the scene for, yeah, it kind of set the scene for where I was gonna kind of grow onto, I guess. I mean, I took up rowing, and then as I was progressing through the sport, I had to specialise more and more. So I did fewer and fewer other sports. And I represented Great Britain for the first time age 16. And then again at the Junior World Championships aged 18, I went through the under-23 team where I won the World Championships, and then into the senior team where I won a silver and a gold medal at the World Championships and was in contention for qualifying for the Olympics. So, I mean, it was quite a progression. When I look back, it was, I'm very proud of everything that I achieved, and it really did allow me to, especially towards the end, rowing catalyzed me being able to stay in academia, because at the time when I decided to start rowing for the British senior team, I was studying preclinical medicine, so I was going to be an MD. But partly because the rowing was going very well, and partly because I stumbled into this research group doing exogenous ketones and was fascinated, I managed to put my medical training on hold and focus in on researching and rowing. And the two it was very difficult to combine the two, but it was much more flexible than perhaps being in a hospital would have been. So I was very lucky that I had the two things that I was sort of super passionate about just about fitted together. It was challenging, but very, very rewarding. So, I mean, I guess I could rewind it a little bit and say I was at Oxford University and I was rowing for the university rowing team against Cambridge. And so and also trialing for the national team, the under-23 national team. And I saw this advert for a research study. And they were like, we would need elite rowers to come, and we're testing out this new energy drink, and you have to do a 30-minute long time trial on the rowing machine. And that was a training session that we would do almost every week anyway. It was something that the national team required us to send in. So I had a really good feel for that test. And so I knew, I was like, well, why not go and get paid to do this? This seems like a great idea. And so I went up and I met the leader of that study, who was Dr. Pete Cox, who was the first author on a big paper that was published sort of just 2 years ago. And he was really spearheading a lot of the ketones and exercise work. And so I remember taking this drink, and it was this kind of like in a protein shaker, chocolate flavored, quite thick. And I was like, well, it's not the kind of thing I'd normally be taking before I go and sort of work out to the max. But and then it was placebo controlled as well, so I was never sure which one I was taking. But it turned out that when I took the ketone drink, I did a season's best. And so I was just really, really, really fascinated. And speaking to Pete Cox more about the metabolism just got me really, really fired up to find out more about it. And so it turned out that at medical school, you have to do a research project. So I was like, oh, well, I'll get back in touch with them, see if I can work in the keto. Exactly. And so really went from there. I went from being a master's student. I worked for them as a research assistant in the lab, just doing kind of bloods analysis and mopping sweat off people's brows as they were doing the cycling exercise tests, and then into doing my PhD with Dr. Pete Cox and Professor Kieran Clark. Kieran Clark was one of the co-inventors of the ketone ester. So I was really working with pioneers in the field of exogenous ketones, and sort of had an opportunity to contribute some research to that field myself. So it's been a fantastic journey, not necessarily what I'd have predicted age 16. I guess I never thought that I was going to be good enough at rowing to row on the senior team because I wasn't very big, and rowers are normally tall and strong. And so it actually ended up that I was a lightweight rower and found the fit there. But then again, I was planning to go to medical school and be a doctor, and now I am a ketone researcher and, pushing forward the fields of ketone supplementation in a company based in San Francisco. So it's been quite a journey and not at all what I'd have expected, but I'm enjoying the ride so far.
There you go. It's amazing how things sort of work themselves out for us, right?
Yeah, you can, even the best laid plans, they never really map out exactly how you were expecting them to.
Awesome. Well, before we jump into talking all about your research and ketone supplementation, endurance performance, and maybe dovetailing into satiety as well, could you maybe outline for listeners the difference between endogenous ketosis and exogenous ketosis with supplementation?
Sure. I mean, that's a really, really important distinction to make, and a lot of people get very confused. So endogenous ketosis means that your body is producing ketones. And in order to trigger endogenous ketosis, you need to either follow a ketogenic diet. So that's a diet that is very, very low in carbohydrates, typically at least under 50 grams a day, more often nearer under 20 grams of carbohydrate per day. The diet also has to be kind of moderate in protein. It can't be too high in protein because protein can be used to make glucose inside the body by a process called gluconeogenesis. And the diet has to be very high in fat. So typically about 80% of your energy is coming from fat. So, you're typically dressing everything with oils and spreading lots of butter on everything, eating fatty cuts of meat, heavy cream, things like that. So it can be quite difficult to adhere to, and certainly difficult to adhere to strictly enough to trigger the body to produce ketones. And so if you're not following the diet, another way that you can trigger endogenous ketosis is by fasting. And so again, this depends on the individual, but it can take several days of fasting in order to trigger endogenous ketosis. And what's required there is for the body's carbohydrate reserves to become completely run out. So liver glycogen needs to be depleted so that blood glucose levels fall. And this triggers the need for ketone production. So that's what's going on with endogenous ketosis. The point of endogenous ketosis is when you are either following a low-carb diet or fasting, your blood sugar falls, and blood sugar is really essential for brain function. The only other thing that the brain can use other than glucose, blood sugar, is ketones. The brain can't use fats as a fuel because they can't cross the blood-brain barrier. And so we actually have like many, many more thousands of calories stored as fat than we do as glucose. And so if we're not eating glucose in the diet, or if we're fasting, that runs out within sort of 24 to 48 hours. And so you have this problem where the brain will run out of energy unless you make an energy source the brain can use. So the body turns fat into ketones through endogenous ketosis, and then the ketones can be used mainly for the brain, but actually all of the tissues in the body apart from the liver are able to use ketones. So they're not just for the brain, but evolutionarily their primary function is for the brain. So that's a summary of endogenous ketosis. And what's different with exogenous ketosis is that you have ketones in your blood, but they haven't come from the fat stores in your body. So, I mean, if we take a very, very high level approach of defining ketosis itself as anything where your blood ketone levels are over 0.5, that seems to be like the widely accepted value for being in ketosis. With exogenous ketosis, you consume ketones in a drink, either ketones themselves or things that can quite easily be broken down into ketones like medium chain fats. And then so you raise the ketone levels in your blood, but that hasn't come through carbohydrate restriction or fasting. It's the ketones are kind of synthetic, if you will.
For sure, and I think that dovetails perfectly into the terrific 5-part study that you guys did using ketone, ester supplementation, and endurance performance. Now, I know this is a really big thing to unpack, but can you give folks some highlights from that study as it relates to endurance performance?
Yeah, sure. So the best place to start is the beginning. So what we did to start with was look at if the body was using ketones during exercise. So we gave a ketone drink, watched people's blood ketone levels at rest, and then made them exercise at 2 intensities. And so what we saw was when you start to exercise, blood ketone levels are relatively lower than when you sit and have the same ketone drink at rest. And also, as you increase the intensity of exercise, the levels go down a little more. So it kind of strongly suggestive that ketones are being used as a fuel for exercise. We estimated that in this state, ketones are accounting for between 16 to 18% of the body's energy requirements. And so I guess one really important point to flag up early on is that all of the athletes that we studied were not athletes following a ketogenic diet, so they were not in endogenous ketosis. And that's what's really cool about exogenous ketones. You can have ketones and carbohydrates available to the body at the same time. So the body has all of the fuel sources that it's able to use during exercise: ketones, carbs, and fats. So that's why we believe we're seeing performance improvement, which we can kind of talk about a little more later on. So then we were kind of looking to characterize the state of exogenous ketosis and how it affects the body during exercise. And so some of the highlights there is that we saw that taking exogenous ketones, even with exercise, lowers blood glucose. Another thing it lowers is lactic acid levels during matched amounts of exercise, and it's quite a significant drop in lactic acid. It's anywhere between 2 to 4 millimolar less lactic acid. So that was something that I remember experiencing when I took the drink. I was very big lactic acid producer, especially compared to some of my other fellow athletes on the team, and so you can really feel when your levels are lower. It's sort of it's something that really makes it very real. You can definitely tell that it's affecting you because your lactic acid is lower. Then we moved on. We were looking at different muscle biopsy samples, trying to understand whether the ketone was getting into the muscle and what it was doing to pathways of glycolysis, what it was doing to fatty acid oxidation. And that biopsy work also revealed that ketones were sparing glycogen use during exercise. So that meant that whilst ketones were present, you were not needing to burn as much glycogen to do the same amount of work. And another interesting finding that we never really yet explained is that it looks like when you take a ketone drink, you burn more of the fat that's stored inside the muscle. So athletes tend to have lots of lipid droplets inside their muscle, and they're able to use that for energy. And we saw that when we added ketones in, the size of the muscle fat droplets were decreased a lot more than if you were exercising with just carbohydrates in the pre-exercise drink. So that was interesting. We still haven't really worked out the mechanism for that at all. So all of this mechanistic work was building up to a performance study, and what we did then was people cycled for an hour at a fixed intensity. It was 75% of work max, and then after they'd done, which is quite intense, it's an intense
for sure.
It's not just a little
walk in the park, right?
No, for sure. They finished this, and I think at the end of the pre-fatigue, their lactic acid, I'm just trying to see if I can see it here. Yeah, their lactic acid is 6 millimolar. So it's a pretty intense kind of effort. Then they do the 30-minute time trial. At the end of that, people's lactates were between 10 and 14. So it's pretty maximal for most people. And we saw ultimately there an improvement in performance. It was 400 meters over 30 minutes. So just over 2%, 2.3%. And to put that in context, that would be 400 meters would be easily the difference between first and eighth place in the Olympic road race. So it's in elite sport, that kind of margin is pretty impactful. So yeah, that's the big one, the big cell metabolism paper, and that was many years of work. And there's still some stuff that we were working on in Oxford that's yet to be published that will kind of add to and complement that picture. But that's what's out there at the moment, and we've had a lot of interest in that work. Certainly enjoyed answering people's questions about it.
And with that work, is it, in terms of, specific to endurance athletes, is it kind of the longer duration bouts of exercise? Like we're talking marathons or even things like ultra marathons or Ironman events where this could be most applicable?
Well, I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is that like we tested it in this very specific set of conditions. So, I mean, the only thing I can say with 110% certainty is that with 90 minutes of cycling, you've got an improved performance at the end of, fairly endurance like cycling. But we understand the metabolism from this work, and so we can make very, very informed suggestions about where there's going to be the most benefit. So my current position is that the longer the event, the more benefit you're going to see because of this glycogen sparing effect. And so, ketones are burnt inside the mitochondria. They're an aerobic fuel source. So I do not expect there to be the same performance benefit in terms of absolute output in anaerobic sports. Mixed intensity sports are very, very interesting to me because there's, intermittent bursts of activity where ketones aren't likely to necessarily help. But then, in between each of the sprints, you've got this more aerobic component to the exercise where you need to recover. And also in mixed intensity sports, more often than not, they're team sports where being cognitively sharp and making decisions is important. And that's certainly something that we've seen in our early data is affected by ketones. So before we moved into humans, we did some studies on animals that looked at mice solving a maze, and we saw that they were able to solve a maze 38% faster having had ketones compared with just normal Western diet. So that was a good indicator. But then in some of the studies we were running at Oxford, we were looking at decision making and cognitive tasks, and we saw some areas where ketones were certainly offering an improvement. And that this is being validated by some other collaborators that we've been speaking to. So I think for mixed intensity game sports, maybe you're not going to be able to sprint any faster, but I think your endurance over the whole game will be better, and potentially you'll be in a better place to make decisions. So, I mean, at the moment, it's educated guesswork. Maybe I'm doing myself a disservice. We understand it quite well, and we can very strongly say what we think is going to happen, but someone needs to go out and run the study, and also, obviously get it out into the hands of athletes, and people can feedback how they're finding it works for them. But certainly multi-day cycle races like Pro Tour cycling and Ironman and marathon, I'm really, really excited to see whether someone can break the 2-hour marathon using ketones. I mean, they got so close last summer, 2 hours 24 seconds. If you've got something that's
absolutely
2% better, then fingers crossed we could see that milestone fall.
Well, it's interesting with the team sports as well, obviously, like basketball, soccer, rugby, these mixed intensities like you mentioned, in terms of the technical and tactical aspects that start to wane as these events go on for that 60 to 90 to 2 hours or into extra time. So I think that's really interesting to see what could come of that. And of course, it sounds like, for sprint and power-based athletes, so the applications might be a little bit more limited, obviously, right?
Well, I mean, so I think in terms of improving performance, then yes, because I mean, if you're a powerlifter, you're very heavily relying on your phosphocreatine energy system. So I don't think that ketones are necessarily going to help that. And then, if you're doing a 100-meter sprint, it's anaerobic glycolysis. And so you really need to be burning carbohydrates to do that work. Ketones are being burnt in the mitochondria, like I said. But in order to do those performances, you need to stack up a good bank of training day after day after day, and you have to, I think actually that's where ketones will be really, really helpful for these athletes, because what we've seen is when you give ketones post exercise, they accelerate glycogen resynthesis and also promote protein synthesis. And we've actually seen it as well. If you take it before exercise, it decreases the amount of muscle protein that you break down during exercise. So I mean, there's all these kind of like smoking guns where it's like, this could be really interesting from a recovery and a body composition type of perspective. Not only that, but this we haven't measured in humans, I don't think, but it's very, very pretty well accepted in the literature about ketones being anti-inflammatory and antioxidants. And so they're activating various components of the innate immune system, inhibiting various components of the innate immune system and decreasing inflammation. And so actually we've had some professional cyclists using our ketone ester as we've been developing it out of Oxford and now here in America. And their feedback is that actually if they take it after a really, really hard day, that they recover way better. They feel much more energized and ready to go again the next day. So I think, even if these athletes, sprint or power athletes, may not see a benefit to that in terms of their performance, in terms of maintaining quality training during a
specific
intense
training
block,
blocks
I think,
and stuff.
Yeah. I really think that where we're going to, we're at the very start of our understanding of exogenous ketones and how they work for athletic performance. There's going to be some sports that they work excellently for performance, and there's going to be some sports where the effect is much less striking. But then also, the recovery aspects and the cognitive aspects and how that all plays into sport. These are questions where we have hypotheses, but we really only need to get out there and test them. And, I think now with the ketone ester being commercially available, we're probably going to be getting feedback from athletes before we even are able to run the science studies, because that's going to just go on a pace, and science is very, very slow. But hopefully feedback from athletes will give us some good guidance on how best to design the research so that we can confirm our hypotheses.
Yeah, it's exciting stuff. And you touched on it a little bit there, but it dovetails into my next question around kind of timing and dosage of ketone supplementation. I mean, it sounds like it would depend on the sport, whether you're an endurance-based sport or a mixed sport and looking for the recovery benefits. But can you give some maybe overarching recommendations around how people could use that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to point out is that there are different types of exogenous ketones that people can use at the moment. So I've been working on a ketone ester. It's a beta-hydroxybutyrate monoester. And that's important because different ketone esters are kind of like different types of ketones glued together. So, for example, you may have heard of Professor Dominic D'Agostino, and he works on a ketone ester that is made up of acetoacetate. It's an acetoacetate diester. So they're very different compounds, and they're going to be used in the body in different ways. They're not the same, not equivalent. Excuse me. The other type of compound that's out there is a ketone salt. And so those, there's several companies that market these. They are generally less effective at raising blood ketone levels. So I studied them as part of my PhD, and now in the last 6 to 9 months, there's been 3 or 4 research papers that have come out looking at ketone salts in sport. And one of the most striking things is that the blood ketone levels are around about 10 to 12 times lower than with a ketone ester. So after a ketone salt, your blood ketones rise from 0 effectively up to 0.6 to 0.8 millimolar, as whereas with the ketone ester, blood ketone levels are between 3 to 5 millimolar. So it's very much higher with a ketone ester than a ketone salt. And I think that that's probably got some implications for the effect on performance. So
they stay elevated for quite a while, don't they, as well? Sorry to jump in there.
Yeah, for several hours. So one drink will raise your blood ketones. One drink that's containing, say, 25 grams of ketone ester will raise your blood ketones over 3 for probably 3 hours, 3 to 6 hours, depending on whether you exercise or whether you are at rest. So so first off, you pick your type of exogenous ketone, whether you're able to use ketone esters or whether you're using ketone salts. And then if you're looking for a performance benefit before an endurance sport, then the recommended way to use that would be alongside your gold standard carbohydrate. So if you normally take like an energy gel or have like oatmeal or a banana or something like that before you work out, you should take ketones along with that, because we believe it's the stacking of the two together that's really, really important for endurance performance. It's not like we actually did one study where we gave ketones by themselves, and you see that performance is kind of the same. So really it's giving the two together that's giving your body all of the choices of fuels, optimal carbohydrates, optimal ketones, and that's what's really going to unlock greater endurance performance. So for endurance athletes, I'm working with a company at the moment called Human. It's spelled HVMN, and I took a role on as a research lead there so that I could kind of steward the ketone project as it sort of rolls out to the world. And so the product that they're offering has got 25 grams of ketone ester in it, and so standardized serving sizes, whereas in the research studies we would body weight adjust the amount. So bigger people may need to take more than one serving, and smaller people could get away with taking less. But that aside, one 25-gram bottle about 30 minutes before you exercise to give yourself time for it to go down. Basically, you could take it nearer if you don't mind taking a shot of something just before you go and work out. But especially as an athlete, you've often got like warm-up procedures and things that you want to do. So any supplementation, it's always just a little bit before the start line. So yeah, ketones and carbs about 30 minutes before you go out and do your workout or do your race. That's how I would use it for performance. In terms of recovery, again, it's very similar to build onto like your existing post-workout nutrition. So, gold standard at the moment is within half an hour getting in protein and carbs in order to refuel and sustain your recovery. And so the gold standard at the moment, our understanding of how ketones fit into that is just adding them in on top. So it's an additive effect on top of your normal regime rather than replacing anything that you already use with ketones. Good stuff.
And any interactions that endurance athletes or even mixed sport athletes for that matter in terms of things like caffeine or dietary nitrates that would any interactions there with that in ketones?
Not as far as we've seen. I mean, a lot of this, my knowledge on this comes from other athletes and myself having used it in the field, not from the research study. So we've never studied it with caffeine formally. I know that some of the ketone salt manufacturers put caffeine in their products to make it feel like something happens. So, it's certainly no ill effects that we've seen. I'd be pretty confident that adding caffeine to ketones and carbohydrates would be like dynamite. I'm pretty sure that would be what I would take if I was going to go out and use it. I would probably like nitrate load, then take my ketones and my caffeine. I'm actually training for a half Ironman in March, so I'm really hoping that I'll be able to get myself some ketone ester to use for that race.
Terrific. And before we shift gears to talk satiety, I just wanted to, last question for you on the performance front. If someone's really performance oriented, or we're talking again elite athletes, with Louise Burke's group in Australia and showing some limitations on that real top end, speed and performance. Is this a potential added benefit of using these exogenous ketones versus the athletes that are typically just shifting their dietary intake and getting into nutritional ketosis?
So I think Louise Burke's study is really interesting, and it's sort of, I guess, additive onto what we did at Oxford. As I mentioned earlier on, they use a different ketone ester compound. So they use the acetoacetate diester compound, and that compound itself hasn't really been fully studied in humans before they did that study. Like people from the Dom D'Agostino's lab had taken it, but there were no formal pharmacokinetic studies, so people weren't sure necessarily how best to use it to raise blood ketones. So actually, if you look at their data, they didn't really manage to raise blood ketone levels all that high at all. I think it was about 1.2 millimolar. So really not all that much better in terms of beta-hydroxybutyrate as a salt. And I mean, that makes perfect sense because you're giving a lot of acetoacetate. So it makes sense that beta-hydroxybutyrate wouldn't be elevated in that study. And so they used I think it was about 10 kilometer time trial, or I can't remember whether it was 10 kilometers or if it was a fixed workload. I think no, it's not more. It's more than 10 kilometers. It took about 40 minutes, I believe.
Yep.
I'm trying to remember the distance. It took about 40 minutes. But they, firstly, I'd say that would probably be a little short. Like I'd expect to see more benefits as the event goes out longer. But the thing is, if you give acetoacetate, it actually impairs energy, or could be said to impair energy production inside the muscle. So acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate get converted into one another inside the mitochondria, and that reaction is dependent on NAD and NADH. And so inside the mitochondria, the aim of the game is to produce NADH from the Krebs cycle and other metabolic processes, because the NADH is what's used for generating a proton gradient, which is what's used for generating ATP. So if you give beta-hydroxybutyrate, it converts into acetoacetate, and that produces NADH. However, if you give acetoacetate, some of it is going to be, because it's an equilibrium reaction between the two, some of it is going to go back to beta-hydroxybutyrate, even though beta-hydroxybutyrate has to go to acetoacetate to be metabolized. There's going to be some backward shunt of acetoacetate into beta-hydroxybutyrate, and that actually uses up NADH. produces NAD, and so that's not helping, let's just say, with mitochondrial energy production, as far as we understand. And it's kind of backed up by some early work done by people when they were looking at isolated rodent hearts. So they would give the hearts beta-hydroxybutyrate or acetoacetate, and the hearts where they were only given acetoacetate would fail a lot earlier than the hearts having beta-hydroxybutyrate. So I think I'm not entirely surprised that they didn't see an increase in performance. I mean, firstly, the compound is very different. Secondly, if we're looking at beta-hydroxybutyrate as an important thing to try and elevate, that was not particularly high in that study. Secondly, thirdly, giving acetoacetate may not be optimal for endurance performance or muscle performance, just because of the technical reasons that we've just discussed. And then, I mean, I'm surprised I only just got to this now. For me, the biggest limitation of that study was how sick people felt. If you look at the results, I think it was one person had to withdraw because he was so sick, and all of the riders reported some kind of GI upset, nausea or vomiting or something like that. And to me, that completely confounds the results of a performance trial. Like, you can't say whether it's the intervention, the ketones, that's made people better or worse if everyone feels sick. That's a massive deal. I mean, I know from my own experience, running, cycling, whatever, if you don't feel great, you're not going to perform as well. So I think...
especially GI-wise is definitely one of those ones that's very limiting, for sure.
So I think like that paper is a really, really useful contribution to the field, and it kind of highlights some things that still need to be answered, like what happens if an acetoacetate supplement is tolerable, and is acetoacetate equivalent to beta-hydroxybutyrate in terms of performance, if you can elevate both the same in a tolerable kind of way. I think that would be like the main question that I think needs answering. But in order to do that, they need to make the acetoacetate ester palatable. So I mean, yeah, top end performance. I'm pretty convinced that there's no negative effect at all of adding in ketones to an event where it's over an hour and a half. I think that's kind of like the sweet spot for it. There's going to be no inhibition of that top end like sprinting, and I think you're going to get a benefit from the glycogen sparing and ketone metabolism. So I think for anything really over an hour, there's going to be net benefit of adding ketones in. It wasn't necessarily borne out by that study, mainly because of the reasons we've just discussed. But I think it's a young field. More stuff needs to be done, and we need people to independently validate the results from Oxford as well. I know that there are some researchers, Brendan Egan in Ireland, and he's working in the field of exogenous ketones. I'm sure he'll be looking to run his own independent studies soon to validate what we saw.
Absolutely, and it seems, as you mentioned, it seems exciting that you can just add this on top of an already mixed diet and get some of these benefits, which makes it really handy.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an interesting question whether people on a ketogenic diet, what benefit would they see? Because, I mean, to me, my current position is that you'd expect that they would see a benefit, but because they're adapted to metabolize ketones, but because our current understanding is that if you follow a ketogenic diet, your top end sprinting, your anaerobic capacity is decreased a little because you adapt to burning fat rather than carbohydrates. That athlete on a mixed diet with the addition of ketones is probably still going to beat the keto adapted athlete adding in ketones, because the mixed diet athlete has got more different fuel sources
sort of the
available.
Best of both worlds, right?
Exactly.
And now if we shift gears to ketone supplements and fat loss, and of course, the ketogenic diet's been growing in popularity for the last decade, but I think the last couple of years it's definitely exploded. And a common misconception I hear people always mentioning is that, if they're in ketosis, they're a fat burning machine. Can you give listeners a little bit more clarity here on some of these definitions?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem is that there's no consensus yet. So myself and the research group that we worked with, and it seems like maybe the research community more broadly defines ketosis as the state of having ketones in your blood. And it's as simple as that. It's like, if I prick your finger and you have over 0.5 millimolar of BHB, you are in ketosis. And then it becomes important to caveat it with like exogenous or endogenous, like where did those ketones come from? That's one step, next step along. Whereas people in the keto diet community tend to, as you just said, take ketosis as meaning what I would call ketogenic. So I would say if you are producing ketones, you are a fat burning machine and you're ketogenic, and that's resulting in ketosis. As whereas if you take a ketone drink, I would say you are definitely in ketosis. You have ketones in your blood, and probably higher ketones in levels of ketones in your blood than if you're on the ketogenic diet. But as you say, there's definitely like people who get angry or upset because they say it's not real ketosis. Well, it is real ketosis. It's just not come from being ketogenic, which I think is a key distinction to try and make there. Because if you take exogenous ketones, those ketones, firstly, they have not come from fat. Secondly, if you artificially elevate ketones themselves have an anti-lipolytic effect. So that means that they slow down fat release from fat tissue. So actually,
not a good thing if you're trying to lose weight, right?
No, I mean, like it's. I think it's open to debate. I've seen people taking exogenous ketones whilst following a ketogenic diet and fasting, and my experience is that it doesn't complete. There's a point where the exogenous ketones are starting to wear off and your own endogenous production comes back online. So it's not going to, it complements, it can be used to complement a ketogenic diet, but it certainly isn't, taking the drink is not making you a fat burning machine. It's actually switching off your fat burning. And so you need to, if you're using ketogenic diet for weight loss, use exogenous ketones as a supplement around workouts. Or if you're having keto flu kind of symptoms, this could help alleviate that. But if your aim is to use a ketogenic diet for weight loss, the drink does not do the same thing. The only way that the drink could be useful for weight loss is, as you kind of alluded to at the start of the podcast, we've seen some effects on satiety, which is kind of interesting, and potential implications for body composition, which is kind of interesting. But ketone drinks do not put you into ketosis, but not the fat burning kind of ketosis, not endogenous ketosis.
For sure.
It's a little different. I think we as a community need to get together and agree on terms, just so that everyone can be very clear about what we mean when we say when we're in ketosis.
And I think that role on satiety potentially is pretty profound, in the sense that, some of the fundamental principles of a successful weight loss plan is that people just aren't as hungry, which is obviously, with all the hyper-palatable foods around us these days, is a pretty big win. So could you talk a little bit about some of the other mechanisms by which it can support satiety, or even some of the hunger hormones?
Yeah, so it's a really, really interesting story, kind of how this came about. So we had been studying the ketone ester drink in athletes and not really looking at it for weight loss at all. And one thing that people would often come back to us saying, and one thing that I kind of experienced myself subjectively, was after you had one of these drinks, you just really weren't very hungry for the rest of the day, just not sort of as distracted by food as I would normally be. And so my supervisor, Kieran Clark, she was like, well, why don't you measure it? And so I spent 3 years, all of the studies that I ran, I gave people these paper questionnaires where they had to fill out on a line, how hungry are you? How strong is your desire to eat? And how full are you? And I ended up measuring with a ruler, hand measuring with a ruler, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bit of paper, and it just didn't really seem. Oh man, it was very, very laborious, and it didn't really seem to me like it was going to find anything, because people weren't really paying that much attention when they filled these in. And also we had some super hungry boys and some girls who could take or leave breakfast, weren't very hungry, and the more variance you get in the data, the less likely you are to see a meaningful trend. So I was just doing all of this laborious measuring and just think I was not going to see anything. And when it came to the end of my study, I pulled it all together and analyzed it, and it was very, very different and very divergent. So people would have calories as ketones or calories as carbohydrates, and they were less hungry similarly after both. But then the longer after the drink you got, the more the hunger scores diverge. So people who had ketone drinks just did not get that much more hungry compared with people who had drinks that contain carbohydrate. They just, by the end of the 4-hour study, they were really hungry again. Whereas people with ketones, they just weren't very hungry. And so that was the first time that we kind of actually got a quantitative measure on there being a difference. And so I went back to all the blood samples that I'd collected and was looking for hunger hormones. And I decided I was going to look for ghrelin, because people had run studies looking at patients following a ketogenic diet. And one of the hormones that was changed because of the diet was ghrelin. And this kind of fits in with people, as you said, people following the ketogenic diet often have more success because they feel more satiated on the diet. And funnily enough, fat isn't particularly satiating. Protein is the most satiating nutrient. So
Absolutely.
there's something, so there's something going on there that's more than just like the diet changing, let's say. And so I wonder whether ketones themselves are having an effect on hormonal secretion. And so we measured ghrelin. We also measured GLP-1 and PYY, two other gut hormones, and we saw that ghrelin is the classical hunger hormone, and it was very strongly suppressed by having a ketone drink, much more strongly than having a carbohydrate drink. And so we believe that's probably the key hormone anyway in to explain why ketones are more satiating. The other two hormones, it was kind of interesting. They more signal fullness and satiety. So I'd have expected them to be perhaps higher with the ketone drink, and they were not higher. So it doesn't look like it looks like ketones are making you less hungry rather than more full. But one really interesting point is that the satiety hormones, they inhibit the hunger areas of the brain. So if rather than, even if they're not high, if they remain low, then that kind of area of the brain isn't going to be stimulated. There's like feedback loops going on. So I think there's still a little bit more to unpick with the hunger story, but we've got very exciting early evidence that's kind of corroborates the subjective experiences of people using the drink over the years. And I hope, so whilst we did not measure, say, ad libitum food intake, if I could have redo the study, I'd have had like an all-you-can-eat buffet at the end and measured if people actually
just
ate
weighed
less,
the food.
Because I think that's, yeah, exactly. That's the answer to your question there. It's like, okay, so you feel less hungry and you've got less of this hormone in your blood, but like, do you actually eat less? That's the next question that really needs answering. And then, okay, if you have all of these things and you eat less, if you do it for, a month or something like that, what's the net result going to be in terms of weight loss? We don't know that yet. But as you say, controlling appetite is very, very important part of success of weight loss attempts. So I'm optimistic, but kind of cautiously optimistic. I think we still have a little way to go. And also, I mean, with working with the ketone ester, it's tremendously exciting how many things it's useful for, and I think it's great that it could be used for elite athletes, and I'm really excited about a lot of different therapeutic uses for ketones. And almost the last thing I want is for it to be like, next best diet pill, take this magic ketone drink, control your appetite, just because I'm naturally a skeptic, and I kind of think people should take a holistic approach to weight loss, let's just say. And I don't think, I
Absolutely.
think that it's only going to be useful if you can reduce your calorie intake and also, make other healthy lifestyle changes. It's not a panacea. So I want to really carefully caveat that. I think it's great. I think it's very exciting. I think it could work. But you can't just drink ketones and then
always looking for that magic bullet. Yeah, that shiny new toy that's going to fix everything for
doesn't
sure.
Doesn't exist.
Exactly. Now, what about other clinical applications of ketone supplements, potentially things like concussion, mild TBI, other areas that you're excited about or that you see in the research as potential applications for ketone supplementation?
Well, I'm really glad you started with concussion and TBI. That's like one of my favorites, and that's one of the ones that I'm most hopeful that we can translate quickly, because we are marketing the human ketone drink for athletes. We can hopefully get it into athletes, get it being used by athletes. And concussion is a huge problem in a lot of, especially American sports like American football. There's tons and tons of concussions. It's ice hockey, very, very topical. And so I'm optimistic that might be something that we can translate and understand better soon, especially given the strength of the animal data there. People have injected exogenous ketones into animals and seen not only a protective effect if they were to inject ketones before an injury, but also an effect whereby ketones mitigate the damage caused by concussion if they're administered afterwards. People have also been experimenting by putting animals on a ketogenic diet and things like that as well, and seen positive results there. So I'm really unfortunately, it's just not ethical to drop bricks on people's heads or run a concussion study in
yeah.
human, like a controlled concussion
Used to
study
be,
in
but not
humans.
anymore, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could get away with a lot ethically back in the 50s. So, yeah, it's a shame we didn't have this technology back then. Maybe we'd have an answer. But I think, if we could find a good like military or soccer team, team partner, then it's the sort of thing where you could use people's historical data and like really get a feel for if this is helping. I'm optimistic about that. But then there's just a ton of other things I'm really interested in. I mean, we've seen that when you give ketone ester drinks to people, their blood sugar drops quite reliably. And the drop can actually be to a similar extent as to if someone was taking metformin. So kind of interested to see how it plays out with a diabetic population as well. I mean, it's interesting for me, like it's a bit less clear cut because they've already got obviously metabolic issues going on. So how ketones fit in on top of an already complicated metabolic picture is something I'm not totally sure about. But yeah, I'm interested to find out more about. Then, more downstream from that, Alzheimer's disease, there's, people call that diabetes of the brain. And I think it starts to get a bit different there because you're coming towards the end of life. And really what you're aiming to do is to maximize the quality of life for that person and for their carers. And so what we've seen when we've actually got one published case study that uses this ketone ester. Dr. Mary Newport published this report. She gave it to her husband who had Alzheimer's for 6 months, 3 drinks a day, and it really noticeably alleviated many of his symptoms. He went from being able to not being able to do like simple tasks like dress himself, say, to being much more mobile. And he did like a clock face drawing task, for example, and there was noticeable differences. So I'm really optimistic for several neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's as well, that there could be an impact. And finally, I guess, cancer. I mean, Dom D'Agostino's group is doing great work with tumor models. He's working with a researcher called Angela Poff, and she published some research that showed supplementing with ketones decreased tumor metastasis and actually shrunk tumors. And so again, really want to carefully caveat this and say it's like not going to replace drugs wholly, but Professor D'Agostino, he works with a guy called Thomas Seyfried, and they're pioneering an approach with hyperbaric oxygen therapy as well as fasting or nutritional ketosis. And so what the aim is to put a stress on the body that the cancer cells can't deal with, that other cells in the body can deal with, because cancer cells often accumulate mutations in their mitochondria. That means that they become very reliant on glycolysis and anaerobic energy production. So if you put people in hyperbaric oxygen and then put them maybe on a ketogenic diet or give them exogenous ketones that slow down glycolysis inside the body, you could help to metabolically compromise those cells, make them more sensitive to any drugs that you're giving them. So this is all very, very preliminary, but it's very exciting. Yeah, it's exciting. I can see now with ketone esters being commercially available and convenient, much more convenient than IV salt infusions, and much more widely applicable than, say, being on the ketogenic diet, because not very many people can do it successfully and achieve a high enough level. I can see this being, a very interesting area in terms of medical and also sports science research in the next 5 to 10 years. I guess one thing that I really want to help steward against is, like the hype cycle, where something kind of comes around and there's all this hype, all this
big for 3 or 4 years, and then
and then a big trough. And so I think, there is probably like 3 to 5 to 10 things. I don't know how many things the ketone ester is going to be amazingly game-changing for, but I'm confident that there'll be like some things where it's going to really, really change people's quality of life or change people's athletic. There's going to be some use cases,
specific applications for sure.
Exactly, that are just bang on, and it's going to be transformative. And in a way, I hope very much that it's like Alzheimer's disease or cancer, or something where it's going to really make a positive impact in the world, because that would be very, very rewarding and exciting. But if it's not those things, if it's there's a certain amount of inherited metabolic disorders where I think this could be really, really useful. I mean, it would just be great to help people with this. So I hope that people continue to explore different applications and don't just get disillusioned if it doesn't work for one thing or another. But I'm really optimistic. I think there's plenty of things it's going to work for.
Phenomenal. Well, Brianna, I mean, so many great insights here on the use of ketones and not only endurance athletes, satiety, but all these other potential applications that you mentioned. So I want to respect your time. Last question for you here, and we're going to shift over to the personal side of things. Can you give us a little insight into how you start your day? You're obviously very busy. Do you have a morning routine? Are you a coffee person, training in the AM? What does that look like?
Oh, I'm definitely a training in the morning kind of person. I find it quite easy to wake up in the morning. I don't tend to drink coffee before I go and work out. I try and build in some like meditation, mindfulness practice into my day. Normally I'm using an app that does 10 minutes guided meditation. So I try and start off my day with that. I like drinking like a
Which app is that you're using?
Headspace.
Okay,
I don't know whether it's a British.
No, that's right.
Yeah, I use Headspace, and then tend to get a bit of hydration in before I go and work out. I'm a big fan of green tea, and if it's not a hot drink that like green tea, then it's normally just like some good old water. And I here in California, I'm big into cycling and running. The other day, I got up at 4:45 and cycled 2 hours up a mountain to watch the sunrise. So it's the kind of crazy stuff that I like to do before work.
Awesome. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's as much as I can cram in before I start work in the morning. I don't tend to. Sometimes I get out quite late, so I don't really plan to work out in the evening. By then, I'm normally kind of tired. So but I normally do something active every day, and it's gets me mentally and physically prepared for what's to come. So I'd recommend it. Get outside, get the natural light.
Fantastic. Well, great advice and great insights. So where can people stay connected with you and keep up with all your phenomenal work and research?
So I am big on Twitter. I tend to share anything that's coming out of our group on Twitter. And you can find me at Brianna Stubbs. I don't think there's a one or anything else like that afterwards, but we can check afterwards. If people want to follow my crazy training, I'm on Strava. Always posting on there. It kind of gets to be a bit of an addiction. You know, one of those people where it's like, if I fall off my bike, make sure you turn off my Strava. So big on Strava. And then also you can follow Human, that's HVMN, on Twitter or on Facebook. And so you can keep up to date with the company and what the company's doing as well.